All right, we'll have another short module, this time on cleavage. You're most familiar with looking at cleavage in hand specimens of minerals, and here's an example of a calcite crystal that shows 3 planes of cleavage. And how we see cleavage in hand specimen is pretty different than how we see it in thin section. Here you can see that there are 3 cleavage planes, one parallel to this line, one parallel to that line, and one that is actually perpendicular to that line there, the top face of that crystal. We see 3 dimensions of the crystal. We see all 3 cleavages in this case, and we identify the cleavage as being flat surfaces, flat planes, exposed on a mineral specimen that are oftentimes shiny. In thin section, it's somewhat different. Those planes are cut in by the plane of the thin section, and so we see lines instead. Here's a couple of examples of cleavage on the left, a hornblende, and on the right, a pyroxene. These are probably, the cleavage itself is probably best seen in plane polarized light, although it's possible to see cleavage in cross polarized light. If you look at those images, do you see any relatively straight lines that repeat in a pattern and cut across the crystal? That's how you would expect cleavage to be expressed. If you were to take that 3-dimensional crystal, cut it through one plane, those cleavage planes are going to appear as lines in your crystal. Some minerals don't display cleavage. Quartz, for example, and olivine. Quartz, when you think of a nice quartz crystal, you're seeing the crystal faces. That's part of the form or the habit of the crystal, not the cleavage itself. Some minerals have a single good cleavage, and micas are a good example. Their nice cleavage forms the sheets that you see in micas. And other minerals display 2 good cleavages generally, pyroxenes and amphiboles. Here's that image from the right-hand side. Take a look. Do you see any lines that create a regular pattern that are relatively straight? And as I just said, pyroxenes have 2 good cleavages. So look at that grain in the center and see if you spot any. I'll wait just a moment. What I was hoping that you'd see are lines parallel to these 2 lines. There are 2 cleavages visible, and they intersect one another at about 90 degrees. That is true of all pyroxenes, although sometimes one cleavage is slightly easier to spot than the second. Here's the hornblende. It might be easier to see the cleavage in this hornblende, but look at the darker brown crystal in the center of the image. Do you see lines that are straight and repeating in orientation? And do you see 2 sets of cleavages? I'm hoping that you saw those cleavages right there. There are 2 cleavages, and in the case of amphiboles and all amphiboles, those 2 cleavages intersect at either 60 or 120 degrees. Here's another one. This is a different thin section. It's XPL this time. Do you see any lines that penetrate through that bluish grain that repeat in a regular order? This is olivine, and in this case, there is no cleavage displayed. These are random fractures, and some minerals display fractures like this. And you have to take some care that you're really seeing cleavage and not just fractures through a crystal when you're looking at it. And sometimes, to actually spot a cleavage, you need to increase the magnification on your microscope to get in close enough so that you can see those cleavage surfaces. So what you learned in this module was that cleavage planes are seen as straight or relatively straight lines in thin section. Minerals can have no cleavage or one or more cleavage planes. And if you see more than one cleavage in a mineral, you should describe the number of cleavages and the approximate angle at which they intersect. So for example, for the pyroxene, you would say something like, there are two cleavages intersecting at about 90 degrees. It's not sufficient to just say two cleavages because that doesn't give me enough information to identify that mineral as potentially a pyroxene. Now I'd like you to watch videos of thin sections 1, 76, and 100 and complete the quiz on cleavage.